All right. Hello. Good morning. Um, let's see. Everything's yep. So I have this stuff spinning around in my brain because regardless of all the state management stuff we've been exploring, there is this thing that's really tricky, and it's data references. So when I say data references, I mean when you get some data from the server, that data has an ID, uh, and you want to like optimally expose that to React. Now in React, so there's two ways to do it, right? You have the immutable way and you have the mutable way. So with this Bonsify project, we're doing like the absolute most performant, simple way of doing state management externally from React using that single reactive primitive. But when we think about the immutable approach, well, I guess above here we have like two types of objects. We have like a record. So that's the thing that has ID. And then we have a record collection, right? And that's typically how we get our data. We get arrays, right? But then in the actual client, we often want to have an object of record. So we also want this kind of thing. We never, like, I've never seen an API that actually gives you data as like an object of, so an example of that would be like ID1, ID2, like this. This is something we do on the client to denormalize the data, right? And this is what we do in the immutable world. Oh, look at that. We denormalize. And the reason we do that is because and this is not like saying that this is bad and this is good or anything like that. This is just to kind of reference what happened. So what kind of happens is that we get these like records down. You know what? I'm gonna put a big R here. Let's make that a tiny bit smaller. So we're getting this record, and what we typically do, let's see, or what we can do, like, so this is the thing, like, it depends on the complexity of this thing, but let's imagine we're gonna like optimally handle this data. So we get some data from, oh my God, we get some data from the server, and then we make it into this thing, right? And this allows us to normalize the data again. So if, for example, you have some items coming down here, item, and then you have some user data coming down here, you're now able to like map or kind of derive these two together. So you can have like a fully component, let's call it component item. And typically that's an array, right? So you can have like a fully worthy component item that where the item has a reference to the user ID, but then you derive the actual user from that user ID, right? And since you have like selectors for this in the component, that component will just reconcile. So for some reason, if the user isn't there, when you render out the component item, if that user suddenly appears, since you have a selector on that user, it's going to reconcile and it's going to show the author of the item or whatever. And this is a really nice way to think about it. Yeah. And then you can choose to like, if you want to like optimally update this. So what we typically do, for some reason we started doing revalidation. I don't understand why we suddenly think that's fine, because it's not a good user experience in my opinion. Or it, at least the way it's being, how I seen it's being used is that it just doesn't give a good user experience. So like I've always built apps where we just do manual data fetching. We update everything in the client optimistically, and then we'd rather have like a notification if something goes wrong. But then it feels like every single thing is instant, right? And that's the experience you want. So even though like SWR, stale while revalidate, is meant to be like, it focuses too much on the, like it's a good thing when you focus on the fetching, right? So you fetch some data and then you show that data until you revalidate all the data. That's fine, even though it causes a lot of unnecessary reconciliation. But it's like on the, when you're updating it, that's the problem when you're doing the mutation, because now you're in this world where you're guided to perform a mutation and revalidate, and then kind of everything's okay. And yeah, you do have optimistic updates there as well. But there's just so much stuff, like it's so complex in my mind. It's like, why not just fetch the initial data and just mutate that data, or change it, not necessarily mutate, but change that data, and then just do the mutation in the background. So you don't even have a concept of like optimistic in the, well, I guess there's some challenges by just changing the data as well, which I really like about the optimistic approach of SWR, is that you handle the optimistic data differently from data you actually have. So if you do just change, like add an item to this item array, that item doesn't yet have an ID, for example. So you need to handle that. That's maybe the biggest challenge. How did I typically do that? I think maybe it's because I've typically been working with clients where you can actually create the ID on the client. It doesn't have to wait for the server to create the ID. Yeah, but anyways, so this is like, let's call it item selector. Yeah, and that creates an array. Anyways, so I'm just dumping thoughts here. It's just stuff spinning around in my head. So the thing now is, in a mutable world, you want the same thing. Okay, let me just think for a moment. So I think the thing, what I'm thinking about is like, in React, you kind of have these concepts for each of these layers. Like this is the data fetching layer. And then, okay, you manually have to map them to this object. Like this denormalization, like some libraries do that for you, but yeah, you might as well do it on your own. And then you have like this concept of a selector that brings it together. But when you do mutable, you have this challenge of, yeah, so the challenge is that the selector needs to be reactive, right? So here you just rely on subscribing to whatever. So this is like slow. By default, this is very slow, because first of all, if you're doing revalidation, you're going to get brand new data every single time you revalidate. So you can imagine here, like this item selector depends on the list of items and the list of users that you have. And every time you want to add a new item, you have to revalidate both of these. and then it builds up this stuff again, and the item select, it just becomes like brand new every single time. But what we're trying to do in the mutable space is that we're like optimally rendering, right? So we're only changing the stuff that needs to change, and components only observes what needs to be observed, right? So initially you would get like a list of these two things. You can denormalize them like this. And then the thing is, you wouldn't actually create a selector. So in this world, you would rather do something else. And this is what I've been exploring, because on one side, you want to have this lookup, because you do still want to derive one from the other, right? But you also have kind of a, how should we call it? Okay, let's, for simplicity's sake, let's call it not item selector, but you have like a item view or something, and not view as in component, but view as in data view. So here you would add, yeah, so sorry, so what the hell? So what would happen here is that any functions to change this item, those would be somewhere else, right? This is just data. And then you might have some add item, update item, and you would do it by ID, right? And those things would be like somewhere else, like way over here. But in an item view, you would put those together. So each item view would have like update item, for example. Or maybe you could toggle completed, like it would have a toggle method, right? So you kind of bring the functionality and the data together into this view. Now, and you want this to be an array, because that's how you consume it in React, right? You consume data as arrays in React. You don't consume it as a record. Yes, and then but you still want these types of records so that you can like do lookups. So when we actually create this item view, we want to derive the actual user. So this is also another thing. No, sorry, that's not another thing. So the point is, how do you like do that most efficiently? That's the thing I've been thinking about. Because you could do the same, you could take the same strategy as here, where you just use a computed, right? But the problem with computed is that they need a subscription. And you don't know when to dispose of that subscription. So in the spirit of like making that Bonsai project as simple as humanly possible, I don't have computed. You can only use getters. So there are two like challenges. There's like, how do you derive the user here from the user ID in the item? That's like one thing. And then another thing is to, okay, so whenever you change the underlying data, how do you keep the item view up to date, right? So meaning if you add another item, how do you, because you don't want to derive everything again, because I will create a new item view for every piece of data, and that's bad for reconciliation. So you want to do something very optimal, and that's what I've been playing around with. And the way it looks is, so I added this thing. Do I have data here? Okay. So I added this thing called a reactive view. And the only thing it does is it takes a function that basically maps the DTO to your view. So here I'm creating a to-do and I'm mapping that DTO to an actual to-do item. Now, the interesting thing is that when I create this view, that view has data and it has a view. And the view is a read-only array. So you can't do anything with that view. You can just consume it. So that's for components. But the data, you can do lookups and you can remove data and you can add data very efficiently. So you can say data sum ID equals to do something like that, right? And what happens under the hood is that it actually adds it to the array, but it pushes it to the existing reactive array. So it doesn't affect anything else. It just optimally handles everything. And even though I don't like adding abstractions like that, I've tried to figure out a way to make that a pattern. But that's tricky to do as a pattern because you need to have that guarantee that the record of data and like I guess you can choose to only use arrays. Maybe that is a simplification. It's just me like yeah, maybe I'm just completely overdoing it. Because like you don't have, so for example here, you don't have in either of these situations, you have no guarantee that the user is actually there, right? It doesn't matter how you look it up. If you do a find in the array or you do like a direct lookup using the ID, it doesn't matter, right? It's just that find throws it in your face because it might be undefined, which is true. While in TypeScript, for some reason, when you do a record lookup, it doesn't give you undefined necessarily. I think it's an actual setting. Yeah. So what you can do as a pattern is just keep the thing as an array. But when you fetch the data, you map over that data and you create your entity. And now the only thing is that it's not optimal for direct lookups. But the whole point is that that's being reduced because in this world, you need to do a lot of direct lookups, right? Because you're passing everything by this ID reference. Yeah, sorry, add item doesn't have an ID. Sorry about that. So maybe we should do toggle, something like that. So these functions would actually like need to reference efficiently what item are you actually like toggling. So you could still use an array for that, but having this like denormalization layer just makes that more efficient. And I kind of want to have that here as well. Morning, Adam. I kind of want to have it here as well, but that breaks the performance. Or now we have to kind of bring everything together again. But you can also, so there's different levels of this. Okay, so let's go through that. So you can say fetch data and you get like this item DTO array, right? And then you map over that. So you get rather an array of items. Okay, but then you have to do find everywhere. So if you want to do any kind of lookup, you have to use find. Yeah, exactly. There's just something about Like arrays is for presentation, right? It isn't an efficient way to manipulate data or do lookups internally in your state management. It's like just the final result you want for your components. But what was the, let's see, fetch data. Yeah, so you can do fetch data. You get, of course, item DTO, but now you do, you create a record of item DTO, and then you derive that to item. Yeah, I should have used DTO here to better explain it, but anyways. But that, now you don't have to use find, right? Now you can still reference the data by looking up here, and you can change it. But then you can do fetch data, item DTO, and now you do item here, and then item. So the difference here is that what I'm trying to do is, with the mutable approach, what you want to do with these views or these like presentations is that you want to protect your data, right? You're not gonna this item here, regardless of these approaches, this final presentation, the components should not be able to just change the data willy-nilly. Yeah, and there's definitely a performance thing as well. But I don't like to evaluate anything by does it matter or not. I just want one way to do it. Like, if the optimal way to do it is the simplest way, then like that problem solved in my mind. Instead of like, okay, let me just do the simple thing because performance doesn't matter, and then let me do some extra work because I identified there's a potential performance issue. I just want that to be the same solution. Where was I? Yeah, so you want to protect this. So what happens in this example, which is what this like reactive view does, is that it allows you to change the underlying data, right? Because you never expose that to the components. You can just change data under the hood. And that will optimally keep this presentation item. Hi, Eirik. We'll just keep this presentation up to date, like perfectly optimal. While if we do this thing, this internal like lookup record has too much protection, right? So you can't go in and change anything because now you kind of made like completed is read only, and you can only toggle it, or whatever, account is protected and you can only increase it. And for some reason in your state management, you want to reset that count, for example, by some other event in your app. So this is what it subscribes to. Like, this solution is like, you get todos.data, which is this thing. And then you have todos.view, which is the final presentation. And the cool thing is, like, if you add something here, add something new to the data. So this could be like a subscription from the server, right? So this operates with the DTOs, and this is the final. So this will be item DTO, and this will be, well, you can actually see it here. So data here is to-do DTO, and view is the actual to-do. So point is, if you get like a change event from your server that, oh, we have a new DTO here, you can just add it to data, and it just adds it to the view optimally. There's no like revalidation or recreating the other to-dos or anything like that. And even if you like delete todos.data ID, it removes it from the view. But at the same time, I just don't like having, and it's even a freaking proxy that does this. But the point is, like, if we are Oh my god, I had a nice joke, Adam. And if we're unconsiderate like Adam is, um, and we don't like do this performance masturbation activity that we're doing here. You could okay. So what you could also do, you can fetch data, you get the item DTO, you can make them this lookup record so that you can more easily derive data and stuff. And then you can just do like object values, and you can do like item, for example. So whenever we change this object, we'll create a new array of these items. Oh, sorry. So this will be the item DTO. Sorry. And then we'll map that to item. Sorry, like that. So we can do that. And that's probably fine. Right? It just bothers me that every time we add or remove something here, the problem isn't this thing. This isn't the problem. That's fine that we create a new array every time we actually add or remove something to this lookup record. The problem is this thing. Because now it goes through all the items again. It creates a new item wrapping that data. And that's completely unnecessary because we just removed or added one single item, right? So this is the thing that bothers the heck out of me. And I did have another approach where we did this like create cache thing. So you would do like, item, like cached item, for example. And you could do like reactive cache item. And when you now did this thing, object values, map, cached item, the way this would work is that you would have, sorry about doing all this in comments, by the way. What would happen here is that now it would actually check, do I already have? So all DTOs has an ID, right? Or at least entities has, which this is built for. It would just check, okay, does the item DTO have, does the ID of this item DTO already have an item for it? And then I'll just return that. So then you keep those references. Classes? I don't think classes will solve. Like you're like the, have you seen my big Greek wedding or something? No, what's it called? My big Greek wedding. Anyways, the father of like the woman who gets married, he's a super patriotic Greek, and he has this thing with like window spray, like, you know, to clean windows, that you can use it for everything. Like if you're like get a sore, like you scratch your finger or something, you could just spray this window cleaner on it and it'll help. You're like that with classes. But yeah. But this one is way, way simpler. Maybe that was a good idea. Because what you would do then is like you would have, so you could have your reactive, so you could have your reactive data. So you could do like, oh my God, what's happening? Oh my God, there we go. So you would have your to-dos, but it would be a map. Yeah, so that's the other thing. Well, I actually learned something. Oh my God, we have to go outside. So what you could do with this, let's just scroll down. So let's say you have data too. So say you have your data. So you want to keep this like internally. So you have your to-dos, and it's all like these lookup records. That's kind of the pattern for this. So whenever you fetch to-dos and you get them, you get your to-dos. And I just learned that you can do object from entries. Look at this. So you can say data to-dos equals. So you can do this. You can say object from entries, and you go in and you build up the object this way. That's kind of nice. It's much better than reduce. And it actually types it perfectly and everything. So this is the initial like to-dos, and then you just return that data. And then you have like whatever state thing where you have your data. How do you handle, like, do you, like last time we talked about this, Adam, you said that you, like when you revalidate your data, you just create like these classes again, right? It doesn't matter. Like we just replace the array and we just go over and create new classes, wrapping the data. But do you have, what would you do if that was a performance issue, or it just rubbed you the wrong way? Yeah, what would you do? Okay, and then you have the data, and then you're gonna create the actual state here. So the state here would be reactive, and then you have the to-dos again, but now it's a getter. And then you can return object values, data, to-dos, and then you can map that to to-do. So now you have like your nice lookup record here. And then whenever you expose it to a component, you just go through values on it and you map it to the to-do thing. But then you would also have to do, if you were going to do that other cache thing, you would have to do like cache to-do. Yeah, you kind of have to do this. It just gets a little bit, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure about it. Like I'm trying to convince myself that you can get away just doing patterns, but we're not even, like this thing is not a pattern. This is very specific. Well, not very specific, but yeah, and how do you assign from one to the, yeah, I guess, so I think you have, so I'm like being even more difficult or making things harder for myself, because the thing I don't want to do, that the one thing that bothers me is like, what the hell? Where do we have our comments? Okay, so, okay, let's look at this one. So I think this one makes most sense, because if I get some update from the server, like the server talks in DTOs, right? So what if the server, I have a subscription to a single item, or I'm subscribing to items, and the server gives me an event with the ID of an item that has updated, right? What I would want to do is do what you do, Adam, which is like, I just want to assign those properties to the underlying data thing. And the reason I want to do it here and not on like the class wrapper or whatever you call your presentation of that data is because then this thing needs to allow you to do that, right? But here in my world, this is completely protected. You can't manipulate this thing. The only way you can manipulate it is through its methods. So having this intermediate layer here gives me the possibility to update the underlying data from within the state management layer, but I still keep like this guarantee of the actual presentation of that data in my components is like completely strict. So, but am I right then, Adam, that you would just like, if you want to update the item, you just update the item class, right? Maybe you even have a method for it, or you just like assign properties to it, and that's fine. That is perfectly fine. It's just that then your components can do the same, right? What exactly the diff between destructuring the object into another and object assigning it? Yeah, good question. So when you have some new data coming in and you have an existing data, maybe we should write that first. So you have like existing data, and then you have some new data coming in. So you can say, new data, or let's call it server data. And then if you're gonna destructure, you would have to like create a new object from it. And this is what you typically do in React, because you want to highlight that this existing data is now new, right? It's part of immutability and everything. So now this object of a reference becomes completely new. But if you do object assign existing data, server data, you still keep the same object. It's basically like iterating through every property of server data and then assigning it to each property of existing data. So I think like you're kind of freed from like this protecting of state. I think that's one of my like, what I really want to enable is like having this very natural relationship to like just protecting state. So you have a lot of freedom within your state management, but you don't have any freedom from your UI. But that just, it's very hard to find that balance in a mutable world. It's simpler in an immutable world because everything is immutable from the get-go, I think. Like, well, it is, but I think that's why it's harder, like with mutability. Like you see even what MobX does, right? With the whole action protection thing. Well, here we're doing this read-only thing. Yeah. But this is the thing. I need to figure this out. I'm stuck on this. I need to find something I feel like, okay, this is a good way to do it in this world. And even though this is much more like a pattern, yeah, it's really annoying because I would be happy here. I would normally be happy with this. Because we're not doing anything special. We're just creating this lookup thing that you do normally. And then just for presentation, you just go through the to-dos and you map them into like a presentation thing. And then as you're doing that, so function to do, yeah, and this is the thing. Now I've finally found the first reason to do like the merge thing. So what I would do for this one is like reactive merge. Yeah, so this one, okay, there's actually a little bit more to this. No, sorry. Here we go. So this should be a reactive to do. Sorry. So we're making these reactive data objects here. Well, I guess they already are, aren't they? Yeah, sorry. It's me. I haven't done this before. So this data is actually reactive, and then I can say like toggle or whatever. And I can say data completed. And then I can say reactive read only to do. So basically what this does is like you have this like DTO, reactive DTO, and you're creating a presentation over it where you expose all the data from the DTO, but it's read only. And then you have these methods that allows you to like control exactly how to change that data. And then you just point to the actual reactive data reference. I think that's like fine. Again, like we're leaning towards patterns and not abstractions. So yeah, but I just don't like this part. I don't like us creating a new to-do for every to-do. And like, maybe that's fine by default, but what if you needed to optimize it? You could do what you mentioned, Adam. Like, so what you could do here is do update, for example, right? So, well, not the way we do it now, of course. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe this is okay, because if I were to update, oh, wait a minute. Actually, this is better, because, okay, so my whole rant around this was really like, okay, so what if I get an event from the server? And I have this like, let's just do subscribe to-dos, right? And then for some reason I get like a to-do here. Something happens to this to-do, right? So I say data.todos, and then I have to-do.id, and then I would do exactly like you said, Adam. You just update the to-do, right? And sometimes you don't want to do the full thing. Maybe even the subscription gives you a specific property that changed, right? So for example, to do, it might even give you the key, right? To do's key value. So you would do like to do data, data to do's to do dot, let's say you get the ID key equals value, right? And doing so, there won't be any new. No, wait, it will be. This is the whole problem. Damn it. So even though that's a good thing, the problem is like every time a component reconciles looking at the to-dos, it's gonna like create this map again. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's really nice. So I really like that. Like we kind of got to this point where, okay, so if you want to update your underlying data, you can do that very efficiently. But it still doesn't solve like every time some component is looking at to-dos, it's gonna map into these new to-dos. But maybe it's fine. Maybe it's just my brain like not embracing this enough. Because when would this actually happen? So this would happen when the whole promise of this is that components will not unnecessarily reconcile. So what would actually look at this would be a to-dos list, right? So you have your state coming in, for example, here, and then you have the to-dos will be state.todos, right? The point is that this component will never reconcile again unless, yeah, no, that's a problem. No, it's not a problem. Sorry. So this component would never reconcile again unless something was added or removed from data to-dos. Because even though we are like running through this, like to-dos map, we get our to-do here. Like what you would do is like you would do this, right? So you would just pass the item to some nested to-do item. ID. Which means that if you were to go and update the underlying data, this wouldn't render again or reconcile again. But this is kind of the problem as well. Like, okay, so technically doing this, like you're fetching data, you're creating a lookup record of this reactive data. So whenever that data needs to change, it being like part of some client interaction, maybe a subscription to a server, it doesn't matter. You just go in and you update that underlying data because you're allowed to do that within your state management, right? It's completely controlled. And then you have like this presentation wrapper, which just takes your data, adds some functionality you want to allow to perform related to that data, but you make it all read-only, right? So the components can't actually go to like to-do.completed equals true, whatever. And then when you present it, you create a getter, which is just the values of all the data you have. And here you maybe have a filter on the user or whatever, like doesn't matter. And then you map it to do. Now the thing is, every time a component points to to-dos, it's actually going to go and create this array and map it into these to-do abstractions every single time it's pointed to. So that would also be the same internally in your state management. So if you're internally in your state management, you would also point to .todos. It will create a new array, map over it, and create these to-dos. But internally in your state management, you wouldn't use the array, right? You would use a lookup record because it's about the data. It's not about the presentation inside your state management. So that's fine. And also in your components, if you were to ever point to state.todos, it would be with the intention of listing them. And as long as you pass each item to a new component, this component will never reconcile again. But the problem is that it's so different from how React actually behaves by default. So just having to like, do you have to understand that? Like it's even more mind-bending than immutability. Because with immutability, it's like everything always changes. But here you kind of have to, okay, when does it actually change? Yeah, that's a good point. You can make it, it would be more explicit as a method. That's for sure. And then the question is like, from a component, do you always want to access the to-dos from the list? Or would you want to well, that's kind of the point here. It's like that's the thing I kind of wanted to talk about here is like when you derive these things, you never want to point to anything by ID. So as an example here, like when you're actually looking at items in a component, you wouldn't look up the user by ID because the user is already there, right, in the selector. So that would be the case here as well. You would, if I ever wanted to point to a single to-do, I would never want to do that because I would never have the ID reference, right? I would always just have the to-do. So if there was some other piece of data that was from a DTO perspective pointed to a to-do ID, I would have that thing derive the actual to-do. So you would never need to do that. But still, I think this, for me personally, this is harder to like technically reason about. Not the code. But like why is this so much more optimal than immutability? Like actually explain the flow of change. Yeah, and like someone looking at this would like naturally just intuitively think, this isn't particularly optimal. But it actually is. And the reason it is because this property is used by components. And when components consume it, they won't reconcile again. Like, unless, of course, as I said, we add or remove a to-do. But okay, but that's a problem. Because if we, okay, so this is a problem. Because if we do add or remove a to-do here, right? This is going to reconcile again. And then every single to-do item is going to get a new to-do reference. Actually, this is going to create a bug because we're keeping the same ID, but no, it's not going to create a bug, actually. Yeah, no, because it has a new reference. So the component will reconcile again. But that's the whole thing. Like, you don't want it to reconcile again because it is the same to do. Yeah, I'm not happy. I'm still not happy. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, so having this thing, like, it just creates both of those things. The only thing you have to define is how you map your DTO to your wrapper. And then you will be able to manipulate your data as normal. You have your view, which is read-only of that presentation, and it's cached and everything. It's like super optimal. And you don't have to worry about it. And then the thing you would do here, which you can see in Family Scrum, is like, sorry, not in Family Scrum, but for example, groceries. Am I doing it here? No. Where was it? To-dos? Oh, sorry. Whatever. So wherever I actually expose the to-dos, I would just say to-dos.view. And that's like no getter, no recalculation of the array, nothing. That is a very good question. That's an excellent question. So the thing, so the short answer is yes, because the thing that the compiler optimizes for is really like if you think about a component and you're using state and you're using callbacks and all of this, there's no reason to run the compiler for a single component, right? As long as everything's in the component, it should always, like, whenever the state changes, it should always reconcile, right? That's the perfect scenario for React. It's like isolated in one component. What it optimizes for is when you start sharing state and callbacks between components. And there's two ways to do that, right? It's props passing and there's context. And the React compiler can only optimize for one of them, which is props passing. It can't optimize for the context in terms of state management. And that's the whole point. I'm also like, I have a big question about the React compiler, because like, like when you reach a certain level of state complexity, you kind of want to have a context, but yeah. But as long as you're not using context, it's going to help a lot of projects. That's for sure. But the reason it doesn't work on context is because the only way a context can signal a change is if the context value itself has a change. So even though it might help a little bit, like every single component that consumes the context will still reconcile just as much. It's more if that component that consumes, well, it technically can't optimize context values, because the only way a context can signal a change is if the context value itself changes its value. So even though all the state and all the callbacks inside the context is memoized, the value, the object that you actually expose on the context will always change reference when you change the state inside that context. That's the only way you can signal that the state actually changed. So every single component that consumes the context will reconcile on any state change within the context. So if you have like 20 components that's looking at the context, and then you're changing like one value inside your state, and that only like one of those 20 components care about, all 20 components will still reconcile. But if they pass like the state or the callbacks they consume from the context to their children again, that's going to be optimized by the React compiler. Did that make sense? Maybe I should draw this. So yeah, you're correct that it does like do the same optimization inside like your context provider, like your component providing the context. But as I said, the actual object that you expose on the context itself, it has to change for the consuming components to know that something changed. So, but this is very much in the world where that context provider represents like broad state management, right? So you have a bunch of state that can change within that context, and then like every consumer will update regardless of what state changed. Yeah. But React is always saying like, use props, don't use context. Maybe that's just how you should do it. Instead of having a root level context provider for your state management. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So and you could like say like, and what is the actual problem, right? So what's the problem with context today? Is it that like these 20 components I mentioned that consumes the context, if they reconcile in isolation, maybe the context issue wouldn't be that problematic, which the React compiler fixes, because it basically, the React compiler basically isolates all components so that they like don't have this waterfall effect when a component reconciles. So maybe it would be fine that those 20 components reconcile, even though there aren't any changes to the DOM, because they don't have the waterfall effect. Maybe. It's hard to say, but as we talked about a few times before here, it's kind of interesting how all these other frameworks are embracing observation. And if React had done the same, we would most likely, or there is a world where we wouldn't have concurrent mode and we wouldn't have the React compiler if they just embraced observation instead. At least the need for concurrent mode and the need for a React compiler is reduced to the point where I would imagine we wouldn't need them, because none of the other libraries needs concurrent mode or a compiler to optimize. Well, I guess that's not completely true. They still have a compiler, but it does different kinds of optimization. Yeah. Okay, but I think I'm done reflecting. I think having an so conceptually what we want to do with data is we want to be able to reference data, update data in isolation, right? We don't want to expose that to components because they shouldn't be manipulating data directly. That's the job for your state management. But we do want to map that data to like a presentation version of that data, which is a read-only version of the data. Maybe it's not even all the data. Maybe there's just certain properties from that data you want to expose to components. And you want to derive so that if, for example, an item has a reference to a user ID, you can derive the actual user and so on and so on. And then you might want to add functions to it. So components can interact with the data in a controlled way. And then you want that relationship to be optimal. And this is exactly what this thing does. And it's so simple. Like it's just... And that's I think the beauty of this is like, it doesn't, even though it handles the performance issues under the hood, it's really there to like give you more freedom in manipulating the data in a controlled way and expose the data in a controlled way. Yeah, so I think I'm gonna keep it. Maybe it should be called something else. Maybe I should even call it reactive data. And then, yeah, I want to call it reactive data. And then there's a property called view. Yeah, so we kind of flip it. So it's about data, and then you have a view of that data. Yeah. But yeah, so you're making really great points about React, and I'm very curious to see where React is at after the compiler becomes a thing, becomes the default. It's like, what happens to React when you don't have to use memo, you don't have to use callback, you don't have to think about how you share state. will it just solve everything? Maybe it does. Who knows? Maybe it does. It would be great. It would certainly be great. But then you have like this other way of like thinking about state management, which is a mutable way, which needs to happen externally from React. Yeah, I looked at it in the beginning. React compiler. Where is it? Didn't they have like an actual playground? Where's the playground? React compiler playground. Do they have? I wonder what's gonna happen. Let's try context. Can I create context here? Import create context from React. And then we're gonna do return context of provider value. Just put the object here and then children. And then I can do like a use state here. Let's see. Const state set state equals use state. Just do that one. And then I want to do like count is state, and then increase is set state +1, for example. So this is interesting. Okay. So we have the state. Yeah, and this is where it sets up the state. Yeah, this is like the initial one. And then T1. Yeah, so T1 gets assigned. Yeah, so here it every time the state changes. Yeah. So every time the state changes, it creates a new context, a new T1, which is the state and the function. Which is fine, right? In this case, that's definitely how it should work. But we could try to add like another thing. So let's foo set foo equals use state foo, and then we do foo. Oh, sorry. Foo change foo set foo to bar. No, what did I do? Oh, did I mess this one up? Oh, there we go. Yeah, so this one's interesting. It's still, oh, sorry. Hi, thanks for mentioning it. Yeah, so this is interesting. So this is kind of like the most isolated example. So you have one component that consumes, let's call it count instead. Count, set count. Looks like shit. Let's see. Increase, sorry. So this should be count. Okay, this is good enough. So you have one component that's going to consume count from this context. And you have another component that's going to consume foo, right? But as you can see here, this doesn't really matter. which is kind of the whole point. So, but first of all, it doesn't separate like the way I understand. I don't know exactly how these. So it assigns count 0, foo 1. Yeah, I guess this is the telling part. So if the count is changed or foo is changed, it's going to change T1, right? It's going to change the context value, which is correct, technically correct. But what happens now is if I call change foo and I set foo to bar, the component that consumes the count is also going to reconcile. Which is currently the problem with context. But as we talked about, like if the compiler isolates the component that consumes the count and isolates the component that consumes the foo, so they don't cause a waterfall effect when this context changes, maybe that's good enough. But fundamentally, the count will reconcile even if we change foo. But what's super nice about the compiler is really you don't have to use the use callback and use memo and all of that. That's the really cool thing. Yeah, but another thing is like, what if you don't use context at all? So what you can do in your app is that you can have like at the top, you can still create like this, just use a hook, right? So you have like a use app state hook. And then inside use app state hook, you have like to-dos, use to-dos, and const posts, use posts. Like you have all these namespaces, right? That you just want to have available. Maybe a session, use session, whatever. And then you just return all these things so that you have like a single point of like consuming your state. But what you would do is that you would then have like your app, and then that would have like app state, use app state. And then you would like have a router or something, router. And then for like a route for whatever, URL, posts. And then you would have like posts, and you would just pass the posts down there, right? So even though, so now if you were on like some other, maybe the session changed some value or something, this app would reconcile again. So this app would reconcile still for like any change related to any of the state within any of these like namespaces or whatever. But since you're passing state by reference, so we're only passing posts here, like these posts wouldn't change reference, even though I changed something on the session, which means that posts wouldn't reconcile again. So that's also an interesting thing. But then you have this other problem, like what if on the session you need access to the user in some nested component in posts? Like, is this post yours, for example? You will want to check the ID of the post with the ID of the user on the session. And then it's like, oh, okay, then we need to pass session again, like, or app state session, because we need that reference. And then, no, but maybe we should expose the session on the context. And then, yeah, it just... Anyways, it's just me ranting. But yeah, I'm very curious when the compiler becomes a thing. how much it can solve. But this sharing of state, this is not a React specific thing. This is also like an issue of, like, if you use Vue, for example, it's not like in Vue you don't have the performance concern, but you still have the same sharing concern. Like, how do you share state? Do you pass it down as props, or do you do like inject and provide and inject, they call it? That's the nice thing about like external state management. It's like you just expose this root state and you can just consume it anywhere without considering anything really. Like, you always have access to it. You don't have to think about performance issues. It's just there. Cool. I have to stop the stream, but it was super nice for me to just rant through all of this. And I'm going to change this thing to data, and then we're going to try to implement it like in this app and see how it looks like, how it feels like. And then yeah, and then kind of the conclusion with this whole insane journey over the few last months, it's like I just want to have this presentation of like embracing React, like the simplest way to embrace React, and the simplest way to embrace external mutability, and like having those two extremes. Like, it's not like an extreme to embrace React, but it kind of is. Or the term extreme isn't the right term, but on one side you can only use React, and on the other side there is this like very different thing from React, but it has a really great developer experience, given that you like understand mutability and subscribe to that mindset. But maybe the story of performance issues, like, I would love that if that wasn't the, like, at the end of the day, it's about developer experience, and performance is a technical challenge. It has nothing to do with developer experience, right? It has to do with user experience. And what if we could remove that? What if we could look at React and how React expresses state management without considering performance? And then, like, okay, how can we best express state management in React? And then figure that out. And then it's like, oh, but you can use this different paradigm, like mutability, to express state management in React. If you like that way of, like, it, you just feel that's a better developer experience to use mutability. So you want to do that instead, but not because of performance. That would be great. Yeah, and that's really what I try to do. Is like this use React signals package that we built was really to make sure that you had something in React yeah, using external store is amazing. I'm really happy they added that. It's the thing that drives observation as well when you have observing components. So yeah, that's really, really great. So yeah, so I think like the experiment here was like, okay, React just isn't good enough, isn't performant enough now for complex state management, like when you're sharing a shit ton of state. Maybe the compiler will fix that, but status quo, it just isn't good enough or performant enough. So what's the minimal thing we can do that is still where it still feels like React? Use React signals. What's the minimal thing we can do? Oh, to make React still. Oh, there's a lot of people creating signals for React. Let's see, use React signals. So again, what's the minimal thing we can do to make React still feel like React, but it is, but it's performant enough, but you can like embrace React. And this is what this package tries to do. So it still looks just like React, but you have these use signals where you can, where you define your state, and you also define your functions here because of like use callback and all of this. Like again, trying to like simulate not having to think about these performance concerns. And it just handles that for you. So this can be safely used with context or shared state. Like there's no performance issues with this. Yeah, anyways. So what does state management look like in React if you don't have to consider performance issues? And then how does that actually compare to going external, using mutable state management? Not because you want to solve performance issues, but just how does it look like? How do you write it? And then you make a decision on that world instead. Yeah, this was nice because I've had like, I'm so like up and down into details, and then like high level developer experience, and then mutable, immutable, data, deriving, like it's all over the place. But that's really, at the end of the day, it's like finding tools that makes developers happy and efficient. And having to write code for performance reasons, that's never been a great developer experience. Yeah. Okay. I have to stop streaming, but thanks for following along, and thanks so much for all the questions, and I hope some of this made sense. I'll be jumping in on another stream and kind of like finalize the family Scrum app, because that's going to represent this like this world of like, okay, performance isn't an issue anymore. This is how you implement it in React, and this is how you implement it with the external mutability. And then yeah, it's more up to the team what they prefer. Is it React developers, they want to stay in the React paradigm, or do they have experience doing mutable state management? But yeah, it's interesting. Like, what if performance wasn't an issue? There's so much, like, that's, yeah, it's very interesting. Like, this whole state management friction in React is driven by performance issues. It's not driven by how to best express state in React. It's so driven by performance. And what if that wasn't the case? What would the discussion look like? What kinds of APIs would we build? Yeah. Anyways, okay, cool. Bye for now.